All right, welcome to the panel discussion on careers in public administration. My name is Nathan Myers, and I'm the director of the Master of Public Administration program at Indiana State University. Today we'll be talking with Alex Barrett, who is a graduate of the MPA program, and I'll let him introduce himself so he can talk about his current position and kind of what he's doing right now.
Yeah, so Alex Barrett, as Dr. Meyer said, I work for the Heritage Group, which is a company based out of Indianapolis. We are a Indiana-owned, family-owned business that is extremely large, but there's a good chance you've never heard of. They like to keep it that way for various different reasons, but we operate in a few different capacities. We have really three main branches to our company. One deals heavily in road construction materials, infrastructure development. They do a lot of interstate projects, things of that nature. One is a specialty chemical production company who deals heavily in like boutique chemicals, a lot of resins, things of that nature. And then the third is environmental sustainability. So they have a whole host of subsidiaries who deal in different variations of environmental cleanup. Our company started during the Great Depression as a kerosene delivery business at the back of the pickup truck and has slowly transformed into a multinational, nationwide corporation that deals in all sorts of different stuff. So what I'm doing for them is I deal in everything real estate related. We support all the different companies in terms of real estate and any associated issue. There's all kinds of administrative and regulatory questions that come up. So it's our responsibility at that point to kind of put them out and resolve them. I also help operate the investment side of our company, which also does have a little bit of MPA-ish ties when it comes to economic development and things like that. So that's what I'm doing. I'm helping in all things real estate related, more or less.
And I will say for the other people in the Zoom, there'll be time later for questions, but if you have a question along the way, just type it into the chat room or let me know in the chat room that you have a question, and we can take those as we go as well. So feel free to interject that as we go through. So the next question is kind of what led you to that position in terms of your educational path and your professional path. What led you to this type of work?
Yeah, so I was a tree all the way through my education. I started as a poli-sci student here at ISU. Ended up getting a degree in legal studies in 2012. Left for a year and went to law school. Found out that I did not like law school. So I came back and I think I ran into Professor Bergbauer at the time, and he'd suggested that if I was still interested in something government adjacent or government related, the MPA program might be something interesting to do. So at that point, I applied for the MPA program, came in, graduated from the MPA program in 2016, went straight to work for ISU in the HR department. I worked in HR here for a couple of years, kind of determined it wasn't where I wanted to go with my career, and had an opportunity to go work for Marathon Petroleum, traveling the country, working on pipeline easements and protecting pipeline easement rights. I did that for about 4 years, traveling all over the country, and then moved to Indianapolis and got a job with Centerpoint Energy doing the same thing with natural gas lines, pipeline protection, more or less. And then after a few years of doing that, during COVID, we were shut down for a while, and out of boredom, I went and got a real estate license. So I got that and just randomly ran into somebody I knew one day who worked for the company I'm at now and said, hey, they're looking for somebody in real estate. It sounds like you have a somewhat familiar background and you have the right credentials, so you should apply. So I did, and that's how I ended up where I am.
Good.
Kind of a winding journey, which it seems like most people who end up in this kind of position have.
Yeah, well, I've talked to several people in these different panels who've been doing that also have sort of similar non-linear kinds of
it's fun.
So what would you say is the most rewarding thing about the position?
So I really have a couple things that I would say are the most rewarding. First, as part of the infrastructure and like roadwork construction development side of it, we play in support of everything they do. So as an example, right now, they're working projects up in Lebanon, Indiana on the Leap District up there, which is the big multi-billion-dollar Lindley development that's going in. And associated with that are all the roadways and the new interchanges and things like that. So we have to go in with the construction side of our company and find all the necessary real estate needs that they need. So like if they need to set up a concrete plant, or if they need to find a bunch of dirt to help build up ramps for on and off ramps, things like that. Seeing those come to fruition over time is pretty satisfying. The other thing I would say is that we do often get a chance to have like mutual wins that aren't that big of a scale, but they kind of make you feel good. So an example of that one, there's two of them I'd really actually like to give. The first one, I'm working on a project in Portage, Wisconsin, where we have an asphalt terminal up there, and asphalt terminals are notoriously dirty, they're heavy industrial, they're not fun. But they had a need come up for excess truck parking across the street from the plant. And when we did some research on it, we found out the lot across the street was owned by the Ice Age Trail Alliance, which is like kind of like a rails to trails type thing, where it's a bunch of walking trails across Wisconsin. And we were able to go in and say, hey, we have this dire need for this property, we have to get it. We will pay you what you own for it and grant you an easement in perpetuity forever across the property, so you can maintain your not-for-profit trail, while we also get what we need out of it. So every now and then you get like a mutual win, where it's like, hey, you're helping the general public, but also like you're satisfying the need. The other one, this is one that didn't quite come to fruition, but we were real close, up around South Bend. We deal a lot with wetlands and waters of the US. And not to go too far in the weeds, but there are a lot of strict requirements for dealing with wetlands. So like if you're going to fill in wetlands or change them in any way, in a lot of cases, you have to offset them. So the ratio is typically like for every acre of wetland that you're going to remediate, you got to create 2 new acres, something to that effect. So we have about 300 acres up there of unused property that a lot of is wetland and undeveloped property and ponds and things of that nature. So I worked with IDEM and the US Army Corps to negotiate a deal where typically they won't let you go across watersheds, but we offered them a 10-to-1 exchange. So for every acre we fill in across a watershed, we would give them 10 back. We ended up not being able to go all the way to the finish line on it, but to be able to come up with creative ideas like that, where it's like, hey, you're actually providing real tangible good while resolving issues within your company. It's pretty satisfying.
Okay. So the flip side to that, of course, what's the greatest challenge associated with your position?
I'm guessing this might be one you got in some of the other discussions, but the biggest issue we run into, I think, is one, like the ever-changing landscape of government, changing regulations and rules and compliance and things of that nature. Because, and this is once again, I'm going to go back to wetlands. It's going to sound like I'm just a wetlands guy by the end of this, but the Supreme Court, it seems like every 6 to 8 years, changes the definition of what they even are. So for us to constantly have to be changing our aim to hit a moving target on what we can and cannot do around all these properties we own is difficult. It makes for a lot of discussions with IDEM, with US Army Corps, all the associated agencies, and with a lot of counties regarding things like that. But I would say that's one of the biggest. The other biggest I would say is the investment part of what we do is trying to prognosticate the next big area that's going to blow up in the state of Indiana. So, I mean, if you had told me 10 years ago that Lebanon, Indiana was going to turn into a multi-billion-dollar tech district and development district, or Richmond, Indiana was going to have potential to be a multi-billion-dollar tech area, I would have said you're crazy just by looking at the cities and the demographics and everything. There's just no chance. Now we're looking at a situation where if you go in up there and you try and purchase property anywhere close to where those areas are, you're looking at a 10-to-1 value of what it used to be. So trying to predict where things like the IEDC are gonna go in and invest a lot of money. So we can kind of get out ahead of it. I'll give you one more too, actually. Turns out I just have a lot of problems. Ever-changing zoning, so zoning issues, we deal a lot in industrial zoning. It's most of what we do. And industrial zoning is something that they don't tend to make more of, just by nature of it being kind of dirty. People don't want it in their backyard, which I get, but it makes what we do really hard. So as time goes, finding properties that still have that zoning or non-conforming, things like that, that we can still utilize is tough. And trying to flush out those issues can be a challenge.
So, if you could, you've kind of touched upon a lot of areas that I think are relevant to public administration. Can you talk a little bit more about how public administration has studied that, has helped you in doing this kind of work or in other areas of your career?
I think conceptually, it's more of a big picture thing for me, because I have this idea that if you can understand the way organizations operate, the way they run and interact with each other, then you have a much better chance of extracting what you need from it. So by having better understanding of how government agencies run, when I go and talk to IDEM, I go and talk to a county zoning board, or I meet with a mayor or something like that, or a planning commission, by knowing what they might be looking for, how they interact with each other, I'm going to have a better shot at getting what I want out of that conversation. It's like understanding the framework of what they're looking for, so you can establish what you need to get it.
Uh, so, what would you say is the most memorable or valuable sort of piece of information stuck with you?
Yeah, I will say I cheated a little bit, and I watched your recording of one of the previous seminars from earlier this week, and I actually heard somebody say something that really resonated with me, and the more I thought about it, the more it kind of rang true. Data analytics. So I have always hated math. I've hated stats. It's never been my thing. When I came through the MPA program, I turned into a stat nerd. Like I developed a love for data. It got to the point where like I started writing articles, editorials at that point. This has been like 2016 for my hometown newspaper, where I was doing my own research and using like those functions in Excel and trying to determine like whether things were statistically relevant or not. That was on a personal level. And then when I started working at ISU and HR, there was a lot of data related things there too, because it was right at the start of the It's on Blue campaign they did about like domestic violence or whatever, abuse. And I was part of the team that was kind of tasked with taking care of all the training for employees at that point in time. So there was a lot of data related to completion percentages and how much of the student or the staff population has like gone through with it and not. So there was a professional like way to use it too. In my current role and my role with Marathon and Centerpoint, it's not as useful because what I'm doing now is much more like almost soft skills related, but that is the biggest thing I took away. I loved my capstone project, even though if you had told me when I was an undergrad that that's what I was going to be doing, I would probably pull my hair out. But being able to just like have an idea, look at it, determine, oh, like that's kind of relevant or it's not, is pretty cool.
What was your capstone project?
My capstone was comparing state-run and national-run healthcare marketplaces based off the average cost of healthcare at the county level. And I can't remember what states I used, but I picked 3 different states, 3 that did state-run healthcare system, like marketplace systems, and 3 that did the national federal run system. And I just compared them, tried to find like states that had similar demographics. I think it ended up being like not statistically relevant, but it was interesting to kind of compare.
So if you were able to, speaking of capstone projects, if you were able to sort of assign public administration students or public administration, academics or even undergraduate students and say, I want you to research this question because it's particularly relevant to my field and we really need to know the answer to this. What do you think you would assign them to look at? What is kind of the biggest challenge or issue that you think needs more study?
I think the biggest thing that I've been interested in finding out is, I mentioned zoning earlier and how restrictive the zoning we deal with is. You run into that in a lot of cities, like just as an example, Bloomington is super notorious for having very strict zoning. I'd be interested to see if cities that have strict zoning, if it has some kind of impact on like unskilled workforces or unskilled labor. So trying to correlate less manufacturing kind of jobs, less industrial jobs to more unemployment. I think there's a theory there. I don't know if there'd be a way to flush it out or not, but I'd be interested to see if strictly zoned areas have increased unemployment.
That's a really interesting question. Actually, I've never thought about that. I'd be curious to see if there actually is any literature out there.
I don't know. It's one of those things that's still on the fringe of like, I don't know if it would or not, because you think about it, you're thinking like, probably on like low skill labor kind of thing. I don't know, it'd be interesting to see.
I mean, you do see, just anecdotally, you kind of look around and you see, like just, and this is kind of a silly example probably, but I mean, like in Brazil, like all this, Brazil, Indiana, where I actually live, you're driving down 40 and there's a guy in the parking lot of a used car place with just a giant grill serving food. Like, he just basically bought a big grill, he has meat to cook. And he's basically just kind of set up his own like open air restaurant. And I guess you could argue that in places that have more freedom where you can have this kind of these pop-up, car repair, places where they can, grill, barbecue, things like that. That actually would make sense that if you have that freedom, then people that don't have employment with other businesses could set up their own small business with a very low amount of overhead, basically.
Yeah, I don't know. I've thought about it a little bit because like, I don't know how you correlate that though, because it feels like a lot of like, I'm from a small town in Illinois and 9 out of 10 people there work in a factory. And it's like, I feel like that's a lot of old kind of Rust Belt small towns. It's like big factory goes up, most of the population of town goes and works there. So when you get in these bigger cities, I guess there's more options for people to go work. So maybe it's not the case, but as zoning becomes more restrictive, it's like you get less kind of low barrier to entry positions. If that makes sense.
Yeah. No, it makes sense to me why they would be connected. So I'd be curious to see. Maybe I need to look up the econ people. Maybe they would. They might have some idea.
Quick answer like, no, it's not related.
Yeah. They'd probably be like, they'd probably be the same way. They'd probably be like, oh, that's really interesting. I'm not really sure. But,
yeah, that would be my biggest question.
So before we get into the final question, again, people in the Zoom, if you have any questions, feel free to let me know in the chat room, and I'll be glad to recognize you and read your question. But kind of going back to what you were talking about before, so you kind of talked about 3 branches. 2 of the branches were roads and interstate and environmental sustainability. And then what was the other one?
Specialty chemicals. So they produce a lot of resins that go into like household goods and just weird things. Like we produce resins that go into like bowling balls, like just off the wall stuff. We don't deal as much with them because that company's based out of Belgium. And then there are other big facilities in Port Arthur, Texas. So they kind of operate as their own individual thing. The environmental sustainability isn't, I deal a lot with them though. And I did mention it earlier, it just popped in my head, another big satisfying thing is working with them because we have a bunch of different companies do a bunch of different things. So the big thing in the last few years has been like renewables and recycling renewables. So electric car batteries, we have a company that popped up a few years ago, and I think they just got another round of funding here announced in the last few days from the federal government. But they just recycle electric car batteries, and they're starting to pop up all over the country. Associated with that is us going out and finding spots for them to go. So like last year, they had us looking in, I want to say South Carolina, Ohio, people look for them in Arizona, just all over the place. We have a company that deals with PFAS remediation. So for anybody who doesn't know what PFAS is, it's a forever chemical, commonly found in plastics. It's impossible to get rid of. It's everywhere. It's in the water, a lot of water. A lot of people, majority of people, I believe, have it in their bloodstream, which is wild to think about. But this company goes in and they're coming up with ways to safely dispose of that and get rid of it. And they have us looking for sites for them in Omaha and Greenville, South Carolina, all over the place. So it's nice to be able to play a part in feeling like you're actually helping.
Yeah.
Helping clean up. Yeah.
So, I was gonna ask you to elaborate on the environmental sustainability, so.
Well, on top of that, we just sold them here a few months ago, but we had a much bigger arm of it that actually did a lot of larger projects. So, the BP oil spill in the Gulf, however long ago, we were one of the main companies that cleaned it up. The East Palestinian train derailment, we were the company that went in and cleaned up the waste and took care of it. So they did a lot of stuff, but for me, my interactions and the most satisfying part of it is easily the smaller companies that are dealing with more niche areas.
What about the roads and interstates? What's could you elaborate more on kind of the involvement there?
Yeah, so just as I think the easiest example I came up with, I mentioned earlier the Leaf District up in Lebanon. Right now, I'm in the process of searching out land for our construction company up there because they want to bid the project to build all of the interchanges that are through the area. Currently, they're doing all the infrastructure within the Leaf District itself, but there's a lot of associated fringe things that come along with that, like a new interchange off 65, everything there. So they need us to go in ahead of them, start looking for land so they can start getting raw materials from the ground to start building up that project. So think of it like this: they have to bid the job when the state releases the bids. The closer you are to the job, the less trucking you have, the less costs associated with it. There's all kinds of they're starting to move to kind of green initiatives too, where you have to submit like a potential carbon footprint and things like that associated with your bid, so you're less likely to get the bid if your carbon footprint's higher. And so like if we can go ahead of them and get a A1 prime spot close to the job site, you're talking about reduced costs, you're talking about reduced impact on the environment, things like that. So like right now I'm going in searching out sites of 100 acres up there, saying, hey, this site's big enough for what they need. They'll be able to utilize materials from it. It's close to the job site. They'll be able to set up plants here. And then once we get it, if we get it, we go in and say, okay, this is zoned rural residential, agriculture, whatever. And we got to work with Boone County to say, hey, we need this to be zoned heavy industrial. We need a variance, things of that nature. We've got to do all the IDEM research on, is there any kind of water issue around here? Is there any kind of environmental potential for hazards, anything like that? Any kind of traps in there that we could run into? And we just kind of run that to ground and then see it through the whole acquisition process. And if they win the job, they end up setting up there and they can work the project. It's more or less that same line of thinking across every job we do across the state of Indiana. You go in, you look for the best place possible for them to go, you negotiate it out, you do all the administrative, regulatory research, run to ground, see it through.
Thanks for elaborating on those a little bit. So you had mentioned kind of starting off as a political science, legal studies undergrad, so kind of reaching back to that experience. is there anything from those sort of earlier experiences that you pull from in your current position?
So it's asking me to think way back. Poli-sci, I mean, not as much. I will say that, and this doesn't really apply to this, but that 1 year I spent in law school, I actually see myself reaching back to a lot because one of the courses I had when I was there was property law, ironically enough. But as far as the poli-sci goes, not as much because I was more geared towards at that point thinking, oh, well, I'm going to be the next big lawyer in town and stuff. And obviously that's not what I want to do, but
at the same time, I mean, there is a lot of, I mean, you were talking about.
yeah, I mean,
with, like,
government
board,
relations, yeah, that's true.
just to give credit.
Yeah, not until 2010. When I really start to.
So, let's see here. So you kind of transitioned from, you know, you got the real estate license, and then kind of transitioned obviously into kind of these bigger projects. So I guess as you've gone through, you know, kind of the, you know, from these sort of different positions, are there any skills that you say have been common across all these different professions that you've been involved in?
Yeah.
What kind of arc of your career?
Absolutely. So my role when I started out of the MPA program here at ISU was training development for staff. And I had always struggled with like a little bit of anxiety talking in front of people. And if you struggle with anxiety going into training and development where you have to go give seminars and talk in front of large groups probably isn't the smartest choice, but it really served me well because it forced me to kind of confront that and develop really, I think, good speaking skills when it came to interacting with people. And that kind of carried on because my next role, both with Marathon and with Centerpoint Gas, when I took them, I was going out all across the country, from the reservations in Oklahoma to downtown Columbus and Detroit, and knocking on doors and sitting down with people at their table and telling them usually pretty bad news about what we had to do with their property. So being able to go into really hard conversations and talk to people and have them be okay when we walked away, I think it takes a refined skill. It takes a lot of awkward conversations, but having interpersonal skills and like the soft skill of being able to communicate, I think is one of the most important skills you can have. Obviously in real estate now, that's all I do is relationship building and going out and talking with people, going and meeting with farmers about buying farmland and being able to sit down and have them think that, you know, this person's not here as a threatening person. They're here to talk to me and come up with some kind of resolution where we all land.
Yeah, it's interesting. You're at least the second person that really kind of emphasized the like public speaking. I mean, another person in one of the other discussions talked about, you know, having more opportunities to do public speaking in the program, which is a little bit problematic from the standpoint of we are primarily an online program. But I have started incorporating more presentations in the classes, so that does address that to some degree. But yeah, the communication, you know, whether it's written communication or whether it's spoken communication, I think, yeah, is definitely one that.
Yeah, I can't understate it enough either. Like, I've had some really interesting interactions over the years with people, just from going up, knocking on their door, talking to them about different projects we've been working on, and walking up to somebody and talking about something they have no idea that's coming, and being able to communicate to them, communicate, hey, it's gonna be all right. There's like a good outcome here. It can't be undervalued being able to talk to people. So much of like, I almost wish looking back that I would have realized this when I was going through my master's and my undergrad more, that like the networking aspect of being able to talk to people is so vital. Being able to have those resources is just so important.
Yeah, that's another, I think, sort of comment that has kind of gone across some of these other conversations too. So you mentioned the company being a multinational corporation.
Yeah.
So is there is there an international kind of relations element here too, as far as dealing with other countries and negotiating some of those things?
I have never really had to deal directly with them. Our land issues there are all kind of unique because we have property in China, but obviously we don't own that property. China does. Belgium, we own it, but we are also, I believe, the last. I would have to maybe look back and verify this, but I think we're the last section of property where we're located in Belgium that's not state owned. And I believe it's on a port, so it's like a very, very high value piece of property. So it's like we will never, we're gonna hold it until we decide not to.
Yeah.
We've dealt with a little bit of valuations in Canada, but besides that, I haven't had to deal directly that much with international stuff.
I mean, you, one of the things you mentioned earlier was the idea of pipeline protection. So that kind of intrigued me. So could you talk a little bit more about what was involved?
Yeah, that's something actually that I would say the MPA degree actually did kind of come into play a little bit on the peripherals, because a lot of what we did was related to PHMSA, which if you ask me, I'll tell you what that acronym stands for. I want to say Pipeline and Hazardous Material Safety Administration, maybe something to that effect. I think the Bush Europe Regulatory Committee that's carried on, but they distribute funding to companies to adhere to certain pipeline safety protocols, and a lot of that is go out every between 3 and 7 years and verify that every foot of your pipeline system across the country has no obstructions or anything that can cause leaks or can prevent leaks from being detected, things of that nature. So I would go out every summer with a crew of guys and we would walk pipeline systems to verify there's no issues, there's nothing that can be obstructive here, there's nothing that can cause damage, cause a mass event where a lot of petroleum would leak out. It's a lot of walking, but yeah, but like is an interesting job. And it came to play because I went out, sit down and explain to people like this is why we have to do this. A lot of it leads back to like it's a government related program that requires us to go out and survey these properties and make sure everything's there. And if there is something there, discuss with you and get it taken care of. So it was kind of interesting. We ran into a lot of different things that I could never imagine being on or close to massive petroleum and natural gas pipelines, but it was interesting.
So you had mentioned kind of the wetlands issue and like the constantly kind of changing regulatory rulemaking kind of compliance environment. Do you see that sort of coming from sort of each level of government, local, state, and federal, or is that mostly the federal government kind of being a constantly changing situation? I guess what I'm asking is kind of how does the federalism element kind of come into play?
So the Supreme Court defining them is the big thing, that right off the top. So I might misquote this, but I want to say the last regulation was something effective. There has to be a continuous flow of water from one source to the other be considered connected. So as an example, think a creek going past a pond. If there's a stream that runs between the two, it's considered connected, therefore waters of the US are protected. That changes. So sometimes it's direct visible. I think that was like a Scalia line, was it had to be clear as day, that it had to be connected one or the other. When it got overturned 6-8 years ago, whatever, it was something like it could be subsurface, it could be flooding, it could be any chance they would communicate with each other. And now it's back to, well, there has to be an obvious. So it's like it's an ever moving thing. So that's kind of at the federal level. At the state level, I know in the state of Indiana, they've really reeled back the wetland protection the last year or two. I don't think it's a good thing per se, because obviously we need more wetlands. It's good for the natural habitat of the state. But it kind of plays into what we do in terms of like, sometimes we have to utilize it. So it comes at really both state and federal levels. The federal one's the big one because we have so many properties where it's like, depending on that definition, it could or couldn't be protected. And that really affects what we're doing.
You'd mentioned kind of trying to, I think you used the term prognosticate, kind of predict, new developments. And so how do you go about trying to make those kinds of predictions? What areas are going to become especially valuable or especially kind of, boom areas, for lack of a better term?
There's a couple different ways. So I will say, well, I'll give you one, I'll give you an example of one. So we were lucky in that since we own the construction company, they start getting bids for infrastructure jobs early in the process. So if they're bidding a job and it's like, okay, this looks like it's gonna be a big development going in somewhere, let's start looking at associated ground and things of that nature to see where we can potentially turn an investment property here and make some money. The other part is when it's clear that there's gonna be an expansion of infrastructure. So I would look at Kokomo as an example, Indiana. So about 2.5 years ago, we caught wind of a decent size, but not huge investment that, can't remember if it was Chrysler who's up there, but they were gonna make into an electric car factory, which, awesome, sounds great. Let's buy some property next to it and utilize it because it's probably gonna go with value. Well, based off that, we kind of realized, oh, with the Inflation Reduction Act and all the associated green energy policies that are going through, there's a chance this might blow up. And sure enough, they've dumped billions of dollars into that facility and things around it. And we ended up not buying any property, but looking back, it's like, we probably should have. So it's kind of just sticking your finger out the wind, seeing what's going on and jumping on it when you kind of sense something happening. That and just getting a read for kind of what's going on around these developments.
Okay. So the data analytics, you mentioned the data analytics being kind of the big, one of the pieces of information or skills from the program that sort of stuck with you. Do you, maybe not, you personally, but does that come into play at all with the work that your company does?
Oh, for sure. So we don't directly do it because our portfolio isn't as big as some of these like national massive conglomerates. But you look at some of the bigger real estate kind of manager companies around the country and the number of properties they have, they're constantly running all kinds of different like pro formas and things to analyze financial value of their property portfolio, things like that. And even to that effect, I guess I forgot that earlier, we do run all kinds of Excel financial models. So we are still using tools more or less that we would have used in the MPA program. So yeah, it's definitely used to identify different financial benchmarks of that nature.
So as far as, so again, if anybody has any questions on anything, feel free to jump in. So one of my last questions was, is there anything you'd like to add, aside from what we've already discussed, any pieces of advice for somebody who's watching this and may want to aspire to a position similar to the one that you have? What advice would you give career-wise?
Yeah, I know we touched on it a little bit, but I'm gonna say it again, soft skills are so important. Communication, adaptability, creativity, they just can't be understated because I know we already touched on the talking to people portion of it. Communication is just so vital. Being able to adapt is really important too. I can tell you, I mean, just by looking at my professional record, that's my ability to like not pat myself on the back or anything, but my ability to like pivot when I found something I didn't want to do. Things are going to go wrong always in your professional career. So to be able to turn around and turn it into a win or at least mitigate whatever issues you have coming up is important. And then creativity, just because trying to find mutual wins, things like that. That it's important. It's important for yourself to be able to feel like you're doing something important in your approaches as well. Yeah, the other two things I would say, and I had a group of interns over the summer this year, and towards the end of the summer, I gave them just two pieces of advice, really. And I think they're the biggest impacts that I've had on my professional career. The first one, I told them, like, be willing to take risks in your professional life. That's something that I adhere to all the time. It's like opportunities are going to come up, and when they do, you should jump on them. They're going to be scary. Yes, you just got to embrace it. The other thing is when you get those roles and you're in a position finally where you're in a professional capacity, imposter syndrome is a huge thing and has always been for me. So you need to appreciate that you got to where you got to because you're supposed to be there. Somebody saw something. So like, have faith in yourself, take risks, and improve your soft skills would be my big thing.
Yeah, no, I think those are all excellent pieces of advice. And you had mentioned earlier the sort of networking aspect, which is something that I think gets talked about a lot, and I think that is a piece of advice that a lot of, I mean, you know, we give to students here at the university, you know, through classes and through the career center and things like that. But in terms of networking, are there any particular pieces of advice you might give people for how to go about networking effectively? Given that I think it is something that's kind of intimidating to people.
100%. Like I told you earlier, I've dealt with anxiety and like public speaking when I was a little bit younger, and that's a big part of it too. Is like it's hard to go to a group of people you don't know anybody and just show up and at work. And it's gonna maybe sound harsh, but it's unfortunate, but it's just a part of it. I have found a few organizations I've joined, and luckily I've showed up and just kind of put myself out there. I've always looked at it as like, it's worth being uncomfortable for 20, 30 minutes to put yourself in that position, because at a certain point it's going to stop being uncomfortable. So it's going to suck, but just put the work in, go do it, put yourself out there, be genuine, and it'll be okay.
And I mean, I guess the only other thing that sort of comes to my mind is that most other people have also been there at some point themselves. So I think there probably is a certain amount of empathy there. People assume that they're being judged probably more harshly than they usually are.
I think you're 100% right. I think you're 100% right. That's a mentality I didn't really realize until I was in my 30s, was like, everybody else has been where you are right now, so they get it. They came from that. So most times you go to these things, it's like somebody will come over and just start a conversation with you, and then it's as easy as, oh, well, now I have a friend, so it's a lot easier.
Yeah.
But no, you're exactly right. It seems intimidating, but it's just a matter of just doing it.
I think that's all very good advice. Is there anything that we didn't touch on? Any other sort of important? Well, actually, no. I did want to ask another question, and you kind of touched upon this a little bit earlier, but you know, are there any sort of big upcoming projects or big upcoming things going on, you know, particularly in the state of Indiana that people should be aware of coming up?
The big thing right now is all of the development in Boone County, Indiana. It's all related to that Lilly development, because that thing's gonna be massive. And when you look at where it's located, on 65, right between Chicago and Indianapolis, it's unreal how much money is gonna get pumped into that. And I think they're even planning 2 more mega sites out there. So I mean, that's where everything's going right now. I know there's a couple small ones that we've been working on in the Terre Haute area. So there's potential over here. I know they've announced some big stimulus packages for some companies coming over here that we've kind of looked at associated things with them. But yeah, right now it's all Boone County. I've gone to some events in the last few months where they've talked about some new changes in northern Indiana, but it's not something that's even really on our radar.
So what's excuse my ignorance on this, but the Boone County development, so what exactly are they putting in
I
there?
wanna say that's a 40. I might get this number wrong, I wanna say it's a $40 billion Lilly manufacturing facility
Okay,
for Eli Lilly, and associated with that, they've started to look at some chips companies, like Intel or somebody's looking at putting something in up there, multi-billion-dollar plant. It's gonna be an entire technology district, more or less, which, like I said earlier, I mean, 10 years ago, nobody saw this coming. You could have went up there and land prices, you would have looked at like farm ground and said, oh, it's $10,000 an acre. Now you go up there, it's $100,000 an acre. It's just unreal. There's gonna be a massive population spike in that area with associated workforces. There's just gonna be a lot of things around that development that really economically blow that area up. So I'd say that's kind of a hot spot right now.
something to keep in mind if you're looking to, get a job in Indiana.
Yeah.
Might be a good place to look. So to kind of wrap up, is there anything that we didn't touch on with any of the previous questions that you'd like to share?
I think that about covers everything I had for you guys.
All right, well, I appreciate, Alex, I appreciate you coming and sharing your expertise and your experience and everything with us. If there's any questions, feel free again to drop them in the chat, but if not, I appreciate the attendance. And if anyone has any questions for me, about the MPA program, about public administration, I'm happy to take those. My name again is Nathan Myers. I'm in the political science department at Indiana State, and I can be reached there. And if you had any questions for Alex, I'd be glad to pass those along as well. But thanks very much for joining, and have a good weekend.